In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up your backend workflows to receive webhook data. A webhook is essentially an app-to-app notification. So an external service will trigger one of your backend workflows as soon as some event happens. This is typically a real-time notification. So we're going to be working with Stripe as our example for this video. It's a very popular use case for webhooks is, with integrating with payment gateways, you want to be notified as soon as things happen with payments. So maybe a new subscription is created or an invoice status has changed, a payment was successful, or maybe a payment failed for whatever reason. And you want to be notified the moment these events happen so that you can then send an email to the customer or update your own database so that things reflect properly in your application. Webhooks are not limited to just payment gateways. They are a general API capability. So if you have an external service that you want to connect to where when things happen, you are notified of those events, this is a great thing to take advantage of. Just make sure to check out the documentation for that external service so you understand what your options are. Payment gateways are actually great ones to start out with because there's many different event types to work with. So let's get started with creating our first webhook here with Stripe as the example. I'm going to create a new API workflow in the backend, and I'm going to give this a name. We're going to say new subscription. Okay, and I am going to color code it so we can reference it easily. Now, the first thing is I do want to expose this as a public API workflow. This is an external service, Stripe is, that will be triggering this endpoint. If I unchecked the box, the only way I could trigger the endpoint is from inside of the application. So with webhooks, you do need to expose as a public API workflow. You also have a couple other layers of security involving API keys that have to be provided and privacy rules that need to be honored. We'll go over those privacy settings in our separate API privacy video. I do encourage you to look at that so you understand what your options are. You also need to understand that some external services may not even have the capability to send over an API key, so you may need to leave things a little bit more open than others. But understand that you can create endpoints specifically for different services so that things are more segmented. You can have conditions on these so that, depending on the data that's coming in, you can trigger whether they run or not, or you can control whether they run or not. Lots of different layers of security you can add here. Don't be afraid of the fact that you're exposing something to the, outside world. It doesn't mean that you can't secure it, once it gets triggered. All right. So this checkbox does need to be checked for webhooks, and we're going to go ahead and run this without authentication requirement and also ignore privacy rules. Okay, now the next thing is we want the parameter definition to be set to detect request data. The reason we want this is because oftentimes with incoming information from the external service, you're typically going to have a lot of data sent to you, and it's going to be formatted in a JSON structure, and there are likely going to be many fields, oftentimes with nested arrays, different objects with lists of things, that you don't want to have to set up manually, right? If you select manual definition, you're going to have to set up every single field that could potentially come in. That could be very tedious, and it's very easy to get the structure wrong. So what you want to do instead for webhook endpoints is set detect request data. This way, you send an initial webhook notification to the endpoint and have Bubble receive that information and learn the structure. Right? It will take it all in, parse it all out, and remember the structure for you. Okay, so you don't have to worry about all of the fields, key names, and the format of the values, or how things are nested within each other. This is going to save you a lot of time, and it's much, much more reliable. I highly recommend you set up your webhooks with detect request data. So notice that when I click on this button here to detect data, I have this window which shows me the address of my webhook, my API endpoint really. This is the address that the external service needs to call. And so you need to copy this and actually put it into the settings of your external service. We'll go through this here with Stripe. And I want you to pay attention to the structure of the URL because you need to keep in mind that, there are test versions versus live versions. You need to make sure your domain is correct. And that all of the wording here is exactly right. Otherwise, the webhook won't go to the right place. So the first part of the URL is just your domain. So right now we can see this is the hosted domain. You can provide either the hosted domain of your app or your custom domain. It'll both go to the right place for the first part. Version test, if you have that in there, that means the webhook's going to go to the development version of your app. Depending on the external service, you may have the ability to do multiple webhook addresses. If you only have the ability to do one, then just remember you can start out with version test in there, but don't forget to change it to remove version test so that webhooks actually go to the live version once you're ready to deploy your application and have everything go to live. Okay, API 1.1, that's just the version of the API. WF stands for workflow. And then you have the name of your webhook, new subscription, that was just created here. Make sure to not have any spaces there because as you can see, this is a part of an address. We don't want any spaces in there corrupting the URL. And then we have the word initialize. Now, this is not technically a part of the real URL, but you do have to trigger an initial webhook with this word here so that Bubble can, again, understand the structure. You'll see what I mean in a second. But once we have initialized it, we're going to remove this word from our settings in the external service because the word initialize isn't actually a part of the real address for this endpoint. So I'm going to leave this window open right here. And now I'm going to switch over to my Stripe dashboard. Now under Stripe, I'm also in the test mode so that I can play around with different triggers here. And I'm actually going to switch over to this tab here. Under developers, you will be able to create webhooks for any event that you want to occur in Stripe. You don't have to set up a webhook for every single trigger. You have control over the event type. So go to developers and then webhooks and we'll land on this screen. I have a couple in here already. We'll ignore those for now because I'm going to create some new ones from scratch so you can follow along. So I'm going to create my first endpoint. Okay, and let me add my password real quick. All right, and the first thing is to add the endpoint URL. Now this is the URL that we copied from that detect window in Bubble. So I'm going to paste that in right there. So for now, I'm going to keep the word initialize in there. Okay, now I want to choose the event that I want to listen to. So again, payment gateways have tons of events that you can work with. You may be integrating with a service that only has a few events, and they may not even give you the ability to choose which events. It might just send a webhook for everything. It really just depends on the service. But here we're going to search for subscription. Let's see here, subscription, not schedule. Let me just type in the word subscription. Customer subscription created. That looks like the one that I want. You can see here, there's lots of different options. So I'm going to check this box. Okay, and I'm going to click add event. I could do multiple events to one single workflow. Depending on the structure of the data, sometimes you'll want to create separate endpoints for different events because it'll be different data with different fields. And when Bubble learns the structure, it's just going to memorize that one structure that you use for the initial webhook that you trigger here. If different events are going to offer different formats and different details, you may want to create separate endpoints. If all of the data is going to be sent with the exact same structure, then you can just work off of one endpoint. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on add endpoint here. And now I have my endpoint created. And what we're going to do now is trigger a new subscription so that Bubble can read the structure of the data. This is to initialize it in order to get things going. So I'm going to go over to, let's say, my customers, and I'm going to create a new subscription so that we can trigger the webhook. Let's see here. I'm going to do let's do this app subscription, $100 a year, and we'll say start test subscription. Could not create, does not have tax behavior. Let's see if I can get a different one here. Let's do not collect tax. There we go. That one looks like it'll go through. Perfect. Now I'm going to switch back to the Bubble window. And here we go. You see how the window just changed for me? So make sure that you do have that window open before you trigger your first test event. And notice that the event that I triggered was the one that I indicated in the setup, right? I didn't just create a payment or add a payment method. I actually created a new subscription because that's the event that I was listening for. And so now this window has changed. Bubble has received that data. You saw how instant that was. And take a look at all of the fields that are here. This is exactly why we don't want to do a manual definition of all those parameters. If I click on show raw data, I can see a little bit better here the format and all of the nesting of that subscription information. So Bubble has everything parsed out for me really well. Now, Bubble's going to do as best as it can auto detection of the values and how you want to use them in the application. There might be some cases where you need to change and kind of correct how you want certain values to be used. So let's say, for example, let's say that this ID was all numbers and you wanted to use it as a number, then you can change this to a number here, and then Bubble will recognize that as a number and you can do math with it from there. The one format that you want to really keep an eye out for are dates. Dates can be formatted so many different ways, and Bubble does a good job at detecting most date formats, but you might need to correct a text or a number to actually be recognized as a date. So just be mindful of this, give it a quick check as you go through everything, okay? So we'll hit save here, make sure you do hit save. And then I'm gonna go back to my Stripe settings, go back to my developers area, webhooks here. Now this webhook here, I'm now going to edit. I'm going to edit the endpoint so that I remove the word initialize, because again, that's not the final URL. That is simply to get things initialized. You can see here, of course, I can also add other events if I wanted, now that it's been created here, but I'm going to update it so that it's now the true endpoint to communicate with my application. So from here, I can now set up workflows and reference the incoming webhook data just like any other data source. Okay, so if I wanted to create a new user, for example, well, actually, let me do a create account. Let's say like this, based on the customer that triggered the new subscription, I can reference the request data's details, right? These are all the details coming in from that webhook information. So for example, let me see if I can find an email address. The customer is probably a customer ID. In this case, I would probably need to do a separate call to the API to go find their email address, maybe make a call to the customer endpoint based on this ID, and then retrieve the email address from there. But all of this is just to point out that you can trigger your actions now to reference that request data information. So maybe I want to generate new records, or I want to make a change to a record in my database that already exists, maybe update the status if, let's say, that this was not a new subscription, but a plan change to the subscription. I could update the existing equivalent record in my database, if I have such a thing, to update the status or the plan there as well. I could send an email to anybody that I need to notify, right? So at this point, you can run your workflow and reference that webhook information just like any other data source. And that's pretty much it. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out just so that you're aware. If you need to change the format of a value, you can always go back to modify types to pull that window up again. You don't necessarily need to reinitialize the call. You would want to reinitialize if you know the structure of the webhook data is going to be different. Maybe you've changed the event type that you want to respond to, and the data structure is going to be different. In that case, you do want to reinitialize so that Bubble understands everything as accurately as possible. Okay. Now, there are also services that give you a way to send a test webhook without you needing to trigger the actual event. So oftentimes within the settings here, there will be a button that says something like send test data or set up, send a test webhook, something like that. And that's really all you need to do versus having to go into the service and having to generate a new subscription or a payment. Again, this is not unique to payment gateways. Payment gateways just happen to be a really popular use case for webhooks, but CRM applications are also really common ones. So anytime a new contact is created or a status is changed on the contact, email marketing services like MailChimp or ActiveCampaign, those will typically have many different event triggers that you can work off of. So if you want to integrate with a service that has important events that happen that you want to be notified immediately, see if they offer webhook capability and go through their settings so that you can add that URL to that and test it from there. Again, remember that these are version specific. So in my case here with Stripe, when I switch over to the live mode, I would need to set up a new webhook in the live mode and put in the live version of this URL. Really, the only difference would be without the version test here. I don't need to initialize it again in the live mode because it would be the exact same structure. The only reason I need to initialize is to have Bubble understand the structure of the data coming in. So that structure is not going to be different from test to live. It's the same structure. Okay. So there you have it. That is how to enable an API workflow to receive webhooks. It's a really powerful feature for automating things and communicating with the outside world. All right, everyone, we'll see you in the next one.